I've been searching for you for 7 years. Your grandfather saved my life.
I'm Marcus Hayes, 38 years old, and if you'd told me last year that I'd be wearing a brown delivery uniform instead of my regional manager suit, I would have laughed in your face. But life has this way of completely humbling you when you least expect it, stripping away everything you thought was permanent. I had everything figured out, or so I thought. Good job as regional manager at a construction supply company making decent money, beautiful wife named Sarah, amazing daughter Emma, who's 8 years old, nice 2-story house in the suburbs with a yard and a 2-car garage. Then Sarah decided she loved her CrossFit instructor more than she loved our 12-year marriage. The divorce papers arrived on a Tuesday morning. By Friday, I was packing boxes in silence. By the next month, I was delivering them for $12 an hour plus tips that never actually came, because people in rich neighborhoods don't tip delivery drivers. It's funny how fast you can fall from grace when the legal system decides you're the one who should pay for a marriage you didn't destroy. The lawyers had been surgical in their destruction of my financial life. But this story isn't really about my divorce, even though that's how it starts. It's about the morning of October 15th when I knocked on the door of a mansion in the rich part of town and discovered my grandfather had been keeping a secret that would have changed our entire family's history if anyone had known about it. The man who answered that door was Robert Winchester, 89 years old, wearing a cashmere sweater that probably cost more than my monthly rent. He took one look at my face and his knees nearly buckled. "You're a Hayes, aren't you?" he said, his voice cracking like broken glass. When I confirmed my name, tears started rolling down his weathered cheeks. This complete stranger, this wealthy man in his enormous mansion, was crying at the sight of me. Not because of anything I'd done, but because I looked exactly like my grandfather, Frank Hayes, a man who'd been dead for 16 years. What happened next would reveal why my family had lived paycheck to paycheck for 3 generations when we should have been millionaires. It would explain why my grandfather, a decorated Korean War veteran, never talked about his service, except when bourbon loosened his tongue late at night. And it would teach me that some men are too proud to accept rewards for doing what they believe is simply the right thing to do. Robert Winchester had been searching for my family for 70 years straight. Private investigators, military records, genealogy databases, everything money could buy. He'd been trying to pay a debt that my grandfather refused to even acknowledge existed. A debt that started on a frozen hill in Korea, where my grandfather carried a wounded 19-year-old private 2 miles through enemy fire, taking 3 bullets in the process and never once considering leaving him behind. Let me back up and give you the full picture of how I got to that door. Life after divorce feels like starting from absolute zero, maybe even negative numbers. 6 months ago, I went from approving $100,000 purchase orders for lumber shipments to scanning barcodes and hauling boxes up suburban driveways. The divorce took everything I'd worked for. The house went to Sarah because Emma needed stability, they said. She got alimony because she'd supposedly sacrificed her career to raise our daughter, even though she'd only worked part-time at a yoga studio by choice, not necessity. I got the privilege of paying for it all while living in a space so small I could touch both walls of my bedroom at the same time. My Uncle Dennis offered me the apartment out of pity more than anything. He runs an auto repair shop and lives in the main house with his wife Linda and their 2 boys. "Just until you get back on your feet," he'd said. But we both knew those feet weren't finding solid ground anytime soon. The construction supply company eliminated my position 2 weeks after the divorce was finalized. They called it restructuring and reorganization, but I knew better. Nobody wants a regional manager who's drowning in personal problems and can't focus on quarterly projections or customer retention metrics. Every morning I loaded up my delivery van thinking about how my grandfather Frank would react if he saw me now, what he'd say about how far I'd fallen. He raised me after my parents died in a car accident when I was 8 years old. My mother Beth and father Douglas were driving home from their anniversary dinner when a drunk driver ran a red light at full speed. One phone call and my whole world collapsed into nothing but grief and confusion. But grandfather was there immediately, solid as oak, ready to take in a scared kid who'd just become an orphan overnight. "Hayes, don't quit," he used to say, his weathered hands gripping my shoulders with callous strength from decades of railroad work. "We might bend under pressure, but we don't break. That's not who we are." He lived by those words every single day of his life. Frank Hayes worked 40 years at the railroad yards, never missing a single shift even when he was sick, never complaining about the arthritis that twisted his fingers into gnarled shapes, or the back pain that made him wince when he thought nobody was looking at him. He raised me in a two-bedroom house on the south side of town where the paint was always peeling and the floors creaked with every step. But there was always food on the table and love in those walls. He died when I was 22, just after I'd graduated college. I was the first Hayes to get a degree, and he was so proud at that graduation ceremony, tears in his eyes as I walked across the stage. The cancer took him quick after that, 6 weeks from diagnosis to funeral. He left behind nothing but his old war medals in a shoebox and vague stories about Korea that he'd only tell after a few beers loosened his tongue. Even then, the stories were never about actual combat, just about the freezing cold and the terrible food they had to eat. War isn't like the movies, Marcus, he'd said once, staring at something I couldn't see, something that was probably 50 years in the past. Heroes don't feel like heroes when it's happening. They just feel lucky to make it home alive. The cancer took him before I could ask what he meant by that, before I could understand what he'd actually been through over there in Korea. The morning of October 15th started like every other delivery day that had become my new normal. My alarm went off at 5:30 in my cramped apartment above the garage. I showered in the bathroom with the cracked tiles that I couldn't afford to fix on my salary, made instant coffee because I couldn't afford the good stuff anymore, and put on my delivery uniform that still smelled like yesterday's sweat, no matter how many times I washed the thing. Emma had called the night before from her mother's house, asking if I could come to her school play that week. I had to tell her I was working again, hearing the disappointment in her voice cutting through me like a knife. I had 43 packages to deliver that day, mostly to the wealthy Oakmont Estates neighborhood, where the houses look more like museums than actual homes people live in. Each delivery got sorted in order of efficiency by some computer algorithm, not because the company cared about my time or comfort, but because they tracked every single minute, every mile, every penny of gas I used to complete my routes. I hated the rich neighborhoods more than anything. Seeing how the other half lived just reminded me of everything I'd lost in the divorce, everything I'd probably never have again. The partners at Sarah's law firm lived in Oakmont Estates with their perfect families. So did that orthopedic surgeon she'd dated before me, the one her mother still insisted was the one who got away like I'd somehow ruined her daughter's life by marrying her and giving her a child. But that morning, I had no choice about the route. The computer generated it automatically, and drivers who deviated from the planned route got written up for insubordination, which I couldn't afford given that this job was all that stood between me and complete financial ruin. Another day in paradise, I muttered to myself sarcastically, checking the address for delivery number 38 on my route sheet. 1847, Maple Heights Drive, the Winchester Estate. The name meant nothing to me then, just another rich family ordering something expensive and unnecessary while I struggled to make rent on a garage apartment and send child support payments that took most of my paycheck. I grabbed the package from the back of the van. It was small and light, maybe a book or some documents, nothing special about it except for the destiny it was about to deliver, along with whatever was inside that brown wrapper. The morning sun was already hot even though it was October, our state being more like extended summer than actual fall weather. My uniform stuck to my back with sweat as I drove through neighborhoods that got progressively wealthier with each turn, the houses growing larger and the lawns more perfect and professionally manicured. By the time I reached Oakmont Estates, I felt like I'd traveled to a different country entirely, one where people worried about stock portfolios and investment returns instead of grocery bills and whether they could afford to fix their car when it inevitably broke down. The Winchester mansion stood behind iron gates that opened automatically when I pressed the intercom button and announced myself as a delivery driver. The driveway alone was longer than my entire apartment building. As I walked up the marble steps carrying the small package, I noticed my hands were dirty from loading boxes all morning and tried wiping them on my uniform pants, feeling completely out of place in this world of wealth. The front door was solid mahogany, with brass fixtures that gleamed like actual gold in the morning sunlight. I rang the doorbell and heard it echo inside, a melodic chime that probably cost more than my monthly salary. While I waited, I looked around at the perfectly manicured hedges shaped into geometric patterns, the fountain with water cascading down marble tiers, the garage that could easily fit 6 expensive cars. This was the kind of wealth that made you angry if you thought about it too long, so I tried not to think at all and just get through my shift. When the door opened, I expected a maid or butler, someone hired to deal with delivery drivers and service people. Instead, an elderly man answered, dressed in an expensive cardigan over a crisp white shirt with perfect creases. His blue eyes immediately locked onto my face, and his whole body went rigid like he'd been shocked. The color literally drained from his complexion like someone had pulled a plug. "Good morning, sir. Package for Robert Winchester." His voice came out as barely a whisper, almost inaudible. "Dear God, you're a Hayes, aren't you?" "Yes, sir. Marcus Hayes. How did you know that?" His hands started shaking violently. Not the gentle tremor of old age, but full body shakes like he'd grabbed a live electrical wire. Tears streamed down his face, catching in the deep lines around his eyes and running down his cheeks. "You look exactly like him, exactly like Frank. The same face I saw on that hillside 70 years ago." "You knew my grandfather?" "Son, your grandfather saved my life in Korea. December 3rd, 1952, Hill 266 near the Chosin Reservoir." The package slipped from my hands and hit the marble step with a soft thud that echoed. Nobody outside our family ever talked about my grandfather's military service. He'd won a Bronze Star for valor, but that was all I knew about it. The medal sat in a safety deposit box at First National Bank because I couldn't afford to keep paying rent on a storage unit for his things after the divorce took everything. "Mr. Winchester, I think there might be some confusion here." "No confusion at all, son. You have his eyes, his jaw, even the way you stand with your weight slightly on your left foot, shoulders back but not rigid. Military bearing without the actual military service, am I right?" He was absolutely right. Grandfather had taught me to stand that way when I was young. Said it made a man look confident, even when he wasn't feeling it inside, when the world was knocking him down. But how could this stranger see all that in the 30 seconds since he'd opened his door? How could he know my grandfather well enough to recognize family resemblance in someone he'd never met before in his entire life? "Please, you have to come inside. I've been searching for your family for 70 years. I hired private investigators starting in the 50s, checked military records in the 60s and 70s, went through genealogy databases when computers became a thing, everything. Frank Hayes disappeared after the war like he never existed, like he was a ghost. Mr. Winchester, I'm on the clock. They track us by GPS. If I stay in one location too long, I get flagged by the system and written up. I'll call your supervisor right now and tell them there's been a medical emergency. I'll tell them anything they need to hear. Please, son, I'm 89 years old. I might not get another chance to do this before I die." "Another chance? For what?" "To repay a debt that's haunted me my entire life, that I think about every single day. To keep a promise I made on a frozen hillside when I was certain I was going to die there and never see home again." I looked at this man, this stranger who knew my grandfather's name, who could see Frank Hayes in my face from across a doorway. His tears were real. The desperation in his voice was real. The emotion pouring out of him was genuine. And something in my gut told me that whatever he had to say would matter more than any delivery schedule or company policy or GPS tracking system. I could lose my job over this. It's all I have left. "I'll make sure you don't. I own shares in your delivery company. Started buying them 20 years ago when I thought it might help me find Frank's family somehow. Maybe see a Hayes name in employee records. I own shares in lots of companies across the country, always looking, always hoping someone named Hayes might show up in an employee database somewhere." "You bought shares in companies just to find my grandfather?" "I would have bought entire companies outright if I thought it would help. You don't understand yet, but you will. Your grandfather didn't just save my life that day. He saved everything I would become, every child I would have, every good thing I would ever do in this world. How do you repay that? How do you find a man who doesn't want to be found?" My phone buzzed with an automated reminder about my delivery schedule. 17 more packages to deliver before noon. The algorithm didn't account for destiny showing up at a front door in Oakmont Estates. It didn't calculate the moment when your past catches up to your present in the form of an 89-year-old man who'd been searching for your family longer than you'd been alive. "Give me 5 minutes," I said, going against every rule in the delivery driver handbook. I followed him inside, my dirty work boots leaving marks on his pristine floors. The house was magnificent beyond anything I'd ever seen up close in person. Oil paintings and gilt frames lined the hallway. Persian rugs that probably cost more than cars covered polished hardwood floors, and a chandelier that probably cost more than I'd make in 5 years hung from a cathedral ceiling. But Robert moved through it all like none of it mattered to him at all, leading me with urgent steps to a wood-paneled study that smelled like leather and old books and money. Robert went straight to a painting of a fox hunt and swung it open on hidden hinges, revealing a wall safe behind it. His fingers trembled as he worked the combination, missing numbers twice before getting it right on the third attempt. 70 years, he muttered, while spinning the dial carefully. 70 years I've been waiting for this exact moment, wondering if it would ever come. He pulled out a yellowed envelope sealed with red wax that had darkened with age over the decades. The paper looked fragile, like it might crumble if handled too roughly. He held it like some people hold newborn babies, with a mixture of reverence and fear. I wrote this letter in 1953, he said, turning to face me with tears still streaming down his weathered face. Your grandfather refused to take it, said he didn't save me for money or rewards. But I made him a promise that day on that frozen hill, and Winchesters keep their promises, no matter how long it takes. What happened on that hill, Mr. Winchester? Robert sat down heavily in a leather wingback chair and gestured for me to take the one across from him. The leather creaked as I sat, probably worth more than everything I owned combined. I was 19 years old, a private first-class, spoiled rich kid who got drafted and thought the war would be some kind of adventure like in the movies. I learned different real quick. Chinese forces had us surrounded on Hill 266. The temperature was 20 below zero. Men were losing fingers and toes to frostbite faster than they were losing them to bullets and shrapnel. He paused, staring at something beyond the room's walls. Back in Korea, back in 1952, when the world was different and he was dying on a frozen mountain. When the Chinese attacked that morning, it was like the whole mountain came alive with gunfire from every direction. Our lieutenant got hit in the first wave, went down screaming. Your grandfather was our squad leader, a staff sergeant who'd been in country since the beginning of the war. When I got hit by shrapnel in both legs, everyone else ran for cover. Can't blame them, honestly. It was absolute chaos, pure chaos, men dying all around us. But Frank didn't run. No. He threw me over his shoulder like I weighed absolutely nothing and started running toward our lines through the gunfire. He carried me 2 miles through enemy territory. The Chinese were everywhere, taking shots at us from behind rocks and trees, anywhere they could hide and ambush us. Your grandfather took 3 bullets doing it, 1 in his shoulder, 2 in his leg. I could feel his blood soaking through my uniform, mixing with mine, both of us bleeding out. But he never dropped me, not once. He just kept moving, kept talking to me, telling me about his wife back home, his son Douglas, who was your father, telling me I was going to make it, that I just had to hold on a little longer. My throat tightened hearing this. Grandfather had never mentioned being wounded in combat, never talked about any of this. There were no Purple Heart medals in that shoebox, no scars I'd ever seen on his body when he was alive. When we got to the medical station, I was delirious from blood loss, but I remember grabbing his hand and saying, "My family owns Winchester Pharmaceuticals. We'll reward you anything you want, just name it." He just smiled at me and said, "Kid, just stay alive. That's reward enough for me." Then he walked away, and I never saw him again after that day. Robert stood up and walked to his desk, pulling out a folder thick with documents that looked official. After the war, my father wanted to honor Frank for what he did. We'd built our fortune making medical supplies for the military, everything from bandages to morphine to surgical equipment. Father said any man who'd save his son like that deserved to be rich, deserved to have everything. But your grandfather had vanished completely. No forwarding address, nothing. The military said he'd been discharged honorably, and that was all they could tell us due to regulations. Why didn't he want to be found? Why disappear like that? I've asked myself that question for 70 years, and I still don't know. Pride, maybe, or perhaps he just wanted to leave the war behind him completely and start fresh. But my father was as stubborn as I am. He set up a trust fund in 1953 with very specific instructions. It would sit there gathering compound interest until a haze claimed it, and no one ever did. No one knew about it except our lawyers and bankers. We couldn't find Frank to tell him about it no matter how hard we tried or how much money we spent. He handed me the envelope, its weight heavier than its size suggested. What made you keep looking all this time? Most people would have given up after a few years. Because I got to live, son. I got to come home from that war, go to college at Harvard, meet my wife Margaret, have 3 children, build a pharmaceutical business, watch my grandchildren grow up and have children of their own. 70 years of life that I wouldn't have had if your grandfather had left me on that hill to die alone. How do you give up on repaying that? How do you stop trying to honor the man who gave you literally everything? Robert handed me the envelope with both hands, like he was passing over something sacred and holy. My hand shook as I broke the 70-year-old wax seal. It cracked and fell away in pieces, dark red fragments landing on the Persian rug between our chairs. Inside was a document from Winchester Pharmaceuticals and First National Bank of Boston. The paper thick and official with typed text that had faded but was still perfectly readable after all these decades. "Read it out loud," Robert said softly, leaning forward in his chair. I cleared my throat and began reading. This trust established January 15, 1953, in gratitude for Staff Sergeant Frank Hayes' heroism in saving Robert James Winchester III, shall be held in perpetuity until claimed by Frank Hayes, or his direct descendants. Initial deposit, $10,000. I looked up at Robert. $10,000 was a lot of money in 1953. He smiled, the first real smile I'd seen from him since opening the door. "Keep reading, son. With compound interest guaranteed at 8% annually, unclaimed and accumulating year over year without taxation." The paper trembled in my hands. I knew enough about compound interest from my business degree to understand what this meant, but my brain refused to do the actual math. It was too big, too impossible for someone like me to comprehend. 70 years, I whispered, the words barely coming out. 70 years of compound interest accumulating. I pulled out my phone with fumbling fingers and opened the calculator app with shaking hands. $10,000 at 8% interest for 70 years. The number that appeared on the screen didn't look real, didn't look like something that could actually exist in my world of poverty and struggle. $2.1 million, I said, my voice barely audible in that quiet study. 2,100,000, and change to be exact, Robert corrected gently. Your grandfather never knew what he walked away from that day in 1953 when he refused my father's offer. He was too proud to accept what he called charity. But this isn't charity, son. This is a debt of honor that my family has owed yours for 70 years, and I've been desperate to pay. I can't accept this. You don't even know me. I could be anyone claiming to be Frank's grandson just to get money. Robert laughed, a sound somewhere between joy and relief. Look in that mirror behind you on the wall. I turned to see an antique mirror in a golden frame. My reflection stared back at me, but for a moment, I saw my grandfather's face instead of my own. The same strong jaw, the same deep-set eyes, the same nose that had been broken in a bar fight before the war, and never set quite right, always crooked. Besides, Robert continued, pulling out another document from his seemingly endless folder, I already had my lawyers verify everything. Your birth certificate, your father Douglas's death certificate, Frank's military records, everything we could find. It's all here. You are the rightful heir to this trust. No question about it legally. This can't be real. Things like this don't happen to people like me. People like you? You mean good people who've had bad luck? Working people who've struggled their whole lives because their grandfather was too proud to accept a reward he more than deserved? That's exactly who this should happen to, Marcus. That's exactly who your grandfather would want to have this. Robert pulled out yet another document from the folder. There's more I need to tell you. My father also bought a life insurance policy on himself with Frank as the beneficiary in case something happened to him before we found Frank. When my father passed away in 1987, and we still couldn't find Frank or any of his family despite everything we tried, that money went into another trust. It's been growing for 38 years now with compound interest. How much? I asked, though I wasn't sure I could handle another shock to my system. $800,000, give or take a few thousand. So in total, you're looking at approximately $3 million. My knees buckled underneath me. I sat down hard in the leather chair, my delivery uniform suddenly feeling like it was suffocating me. $3 million. I made $30,000 a year delivering packages up driveways. $3 million was 100 years of work at my current wages. It was Emma's entire college education paid for without loans. It was a house of my own without having to rent. It was freedom from the crushing weight of financial fear that had been my constant companion since the divorce destroyed my life. Why? I asked, looking up at Robert with tears in my own eyes now. Why keep looking all these years? You could have just let it go, moved on with your life. Robert walked to his desk and opened a drawer, pulling out a photograph, black and white, worn at the edges from being handled so many times over the decades. This is my family. My wife, Margaret, who passed away 5 years ago from cancer, my son, James, my daughters, Patricia and Carol, 7 grandchildren, 2 great-grandchildren with another one on the way this spring. He placed the photo in my hands carefully. They were all smiling, gathered around a Christmas tree, the kind of family photo that tells you everything you need to know about happiness and love. None of them would exist if your grandfather had left me on that hill to die alone in the snow. Every birthday, every graduation, every wedding, every moment of joy and love and life in this photograph, I owe to Frank Hayes. The money sitting in those trusts is nothing compared to what he gave me, but it's all I have left to offer now. He never said anything to us, never mentioned you or the money or what happened on that hill. That's because he was a real hero, son. Real heroes don't talk about what they've done. They just carry it quietly inside themselves and move on with their lives like it was nothing special, like anyone would have done the same thing. 3 hours later, I sat in my delivery van outside the Winchester mansion, holding verified bank documents for nearly $3 million in my shaking hands. Robert had called his lawyers right there in the study, and they'd arrived within an hour with all the paperwork already prepared like they'd been waiting decades for this moment. Everything was completely legitimate. The money would be transferred to an account in my name within 5 business days once all the paperwork cleared. I'd signed so many documents, my hand cramped, each signature making it more real, more impossible to deny that this was actually happening. Robert had walked me to the door, moving slowly, but with purpose. Your grandfather gave me 70 more years of life, he said, gripping my shoulder with surprising strength for his age. I built a pharmaceutical empire that employs thousands, had 3 children, 7 grandchildren, watched them all grow up and have children of their own. None of that would exist without Frank Hayes. This money isn't a gift, Marcus. It's a debt that's finally being paid after 70 years of searching. Why didn't he ever tell us about this, about you and what he did? That was Frank. He never saw himself as a hero doing anything special or extraordinary. To him, he was just doing what needed to be done. What any decent man would do in that situation. I met him once after the war, you know. Tracked him down in 1953 to a factory in Ohio where he was working on an assembly line. I tried to give him the money then, tried to explain what it meant to me and my family. You know what he said to me? What? He said, "Kid, you living your life is payment enough for me. Go home to your family and forget about Korea. Forget about that hill and just live well." Then he walked away from $10,000 like it was absolutely nothing. Like I was offering him pocket change instead of life-changing money that could have set up his family for generations. That night, I called my Uncle Dennis and told him everything that had happened that day. At first, he thought I was joking around, trying to make light of my terrible situation with some fantasy story. Then he thought I'd been scammed by some sophisticated con artist. When I sent him photos of all the verified documents with law firm letterheads and bank seals, he went silent for so long I thought the call had dropped and I checked my phone. Dad never said a word. Uncle Dennis finally choked out, and I could hear him crying on the other end of the line. We grew up with nothing, Marcus. Absolutely nothing. Mom worked 3 jobs after Dad hurt his back at the rail yard and couldn't work anymore. We ate beans and rice 4 nights a week, wore hand-me-down clothes from church donation bins, never had anything new. He could have claimed that money any time and given us all a better life, any time at all during those hard years. He was too proud to accept it, Uncle Dennis. No, Marcus. He was teaching us something important about character, that you don't do the right thing because you expect rewards or recognition. You do it because it's right, because it's who you are as a person deep down inside. But I wish he'd been a little less proud and a little more practical about it. Mom died still working 2 jobs, still worried about paying bills every month. That money could have changed everything for her, given her some peace. 2 weeks later, I stood in my new office at Hayes Construction Supply, a business I'd started with, part of the trust money. The rest went into college funds for Emma and Uncle Dennis's 2 boys, so they'd never have to worry about student loans. I hired 5 employees in the first month, all military veterans who needed work and a second chance at stability. On my desk, I kept Gramps' bronze star in a frame, finally understanding why he'd never claimed the reward that was rightfully his all those years ago. My ex-wife Sarah called when she heard about my sudden windfall through mutual friends who couldn't keep quiet. Suddenly, she thought we should talk about reconciliation. Maybe try to work things out for Emma's sake, she said. I told her the only thing we needed to discuss was Emma's college fund, which was now fully funded through graduate school if she wanted it, and that she'd never have to worry about money for her education. The silence on her end of that phone call was worth more than any argument could ever be. But the real change wasn't actually the money itself. It was understanding where I came from, who my grandfather really was beneath the surface. Every morning when I walked into my business, I thought about a 20-something soldier carrying a wounded teenager through enemy fire, refusing to let go, even when bullets tore through his own body and he was bleeding out. That was my blood, my heritage, my real legacy that mattered more than any bank account. 6 months after that October morning, Robert Winchester passed away peacefully in his sleep. His son James called to tell me and to pass along his father's final words. "Tell Marcus I finally kept my promise to Frank after all these years. Tell him the debt is paid." At Robert's funeral, hundreds of people gathered to honor a man who'd built an empire, donated millions to veterans' causes, and spent 70 years trying to repay a debt he felt he owed. But I knew the truth. The debt was never really his to pay. My grandfather had given freely without expectation of anything, without even leaving his name behind for recognition or reward. The delivery company routes still take drivers past the Winchester mansion every day. Sometimes I see them walking up those marble steps with packages, and I remember the day one simple delivery changed everything about my life. Not because of the money, though that certainly helped me rebuild, but because it revealed who my grandfather really was and in turn showed me who I could become if I followed his example. Hays don't quit. We might deliver packages for a while when life knocks us down hard, but we're always carrying more than just boxes. We're carrying the legacy of those who came before us, even when we don't know it yet or understand what it means. My grandfather carried Robert Winchester 2 miles through hell without expecting anything in return. Robert carried his gratitude and determination to repay that debt for 70 years of his life. Now I carry their story and the responsibility to live up to both their examples every single day. Some gifts are too precious to be measured in dollars and cents, but sometimes money is the only way left to say thank you after 7 decades of searching for someone to give it to.